Book in our Bible that tells the story of a man who lived long ago, whose name is synonymous with suffering. His name is Job. Job suffered a lot. He lost everything: family, possessions, health. He was a mess. And he asked a few questions like, why? And why me? You ever asked one of those questions? I'll bet you have, and whether you intended it or not, you sent them straight to God for an answer. Job asked his questions persistently and with passion. Not only did he refuse to take no for an answer, he refused to take silence for an answer. He refused to take cliches for an answer. Job would not let God off the hook. Job did not turn to friends or professionals for answers. He took his suffering and his complaints straight to God. Job is an important book to read and study. Today we'll only touch on it, but perhaps we should return on another occasion and spend several sessions with Job. Job is important to us because Job suffered in many ways that we suffer, in the areas of family, personal health, and our possessions. Job is also important because he questioned and he protested what was going on in his life, and he went to God with his questions. I invite you to give ear to the 23rd chapter of the book of Job. It is here that Job begins a defense of sorts before God.
Then Job replied, "Even today my complaint is bitter. His hand is heavy in spite of my groaning. If only I knew where to find him. If only I could go to his dwelling. I would state my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would find out where he would answer me and consider what he would say. Would he oppose me with great power? No, he would not press charges against me. There an upright man could present his case before him, and I would be delivered forever from my judge. Before I go to the east, he is not there. If I go to the west, I do not find him. When he is at work in the north, I do not see him. When he turns to the south, I catch no glimpse of him. But he knows the way that I take. When he has tested me, I will come forth as gold. My feet have closely followed his steps. I have kept his ways without turning aside. I have not departed from the commands of his lips. I have treasured the words of his mouth more than my daily bread. But he stands alone, and who can oppose him? He does whatever he pleases. He carries out his decree against me, and many such plans he still has in store. That is why I am terrified before him. When I think of all this, I fear him. God has made my heart faint. The Almighty has terrified me, yet I am not silent, and the darkness by the thick darkness that covers my face.
This is the word.
Wow. And all of that, still, I will turn to him. Still, I will not lose faith. Have you ever noticed that sometimes questions really aren't questions? I mean, when was the last time you got pulled over by a policeman? They walk up to the window and they say, "Pastor Ron, are you running a little late this morning?" That's not a question. That's just a nice way of saying, you're fixing to get a ticket. And that's when I ask my famous question, or maybe a warning, sir? Ma'am? Oh. Ever had someone say, why did we go this way? That's not really a question, is it? It's a way of saying, I think I would have gone the other way. Or why did you? Well, anyhow. We know that sometimes a question is not really a question. But there are times when questions really are questions. There are questions that we have sometimes that we really struggle with, and we really would like some help. Sometimes we don't understand why. And sometimes we don't understand why me. Why could it be someone else? Sooner or later, I think, all of us find ourselves in Job's shoes. Let's have a word of prayer. Gracious God, we know that we live with lots of questions each and every day. Help us to live with those questions. Help us to live with the answers. Help us to live with the seeking out of those answers, Lord. When there is silence, help us to hear that as an affirmation as well. May the words of my mouth today, and may the words of all of our hearts, God, may they be acceptable in your sight. You are our strength, rock, and you are our Redeemer. Amen. Job, life had run, it just run right over him in the fast lane. Job had lost his family. Job had lost his wealth. Job had lost his good health. There's one real famous, wonderful little quote in the book of Job where his wife just finally turns to him and says, you know, why don't you just curse God and die? You know, Job really had everything happen to him that is imaginable. And the worst, he didn't see any of it coming. Job had no idea that this misery was on the way. So many of us have had heartaches. So many of us have had disastrous things happen to them, and we knew full well it was headed our way. We knew. I mean, we look at our car stuck on the side of the road, and we know that for 60 miles, that little beeping sound on the dashboard has been trying to tell us, you're about to run out of gas here. And when we found ourselves stuck on the side of the road, we know we brought it on ourselves because we didn't take care of business. We know that sometimes our checkbook is pretty bleak. We're trying to figure out how to make ends meet. And we know that, well, sometimes we haven't been real prudent with the way we've spent our funds. We know that sometimes, well, you ever get a really bad toothache and you go, man, I knew this was coming. You know, we all know that there are times in our lives when we bring misfortune on ourselves. We know that. There are times when we just deserve a good swift kick in the ego. But we know that there are times when we've done everything right. We know there are times when we really didn't deserve the catastrophe that came falling down on us. Sometimes it seems we're simply in the wrong place at the wrong moment in history, and we cry out at the heavens, God, why? Why me? Why my family? Why my church? God, what is going on? Why do good things happen to bad people? And why does so much bad happen to good people sometimes? We were doing prayers and concerns, joys and concerns at the 8 o'clock service earlier, and I was leading that portion of the worship service. And I remember, I think it was you, Louise, that turned in a prayer request for a young girl that's suffering from leukemia, 3 years old. I wonder if her mom goes to the floor sometimes and goes, God, why? Why? What did that little girl do to deserve that? Nothing. It just happens. Life is that way sometimes. And we ask why. And sometimes we want to know, why me? Why not someone else? I've had fun over the last several weeks, the last several months, asking a question. I would pop up to people and I'd say, if you could ask God one question, what would it be? If you could ask God just one question, what would it be? And I've loved some of the responses that I've had from that question. They've been fun. Now, there are a lot of you here this morning that didn't get a chance to chime in and tell me what question you would like to ask God. So I'm going to give you a chance right now. Now, I don't want to hear anybody say, God, tell me the winning numbers for the lottery today. I don't want to hear that. But if you can ask God a question, what would you like to ask God? Anybody? Wow. I'll take your silence as a giant question.
I don't understand why we can't all treat each other with love.
I don't understand why we can't.
Can't all treat each other with
Why we
love.
just can't treat each other with love.
The whole world, because that's
Yeah.
what we're supposed to.
It would work for me too. Absolutely. You know, I've got friends that say, you know, God, why did you invent lizards? You know, I don't know. You know what? You know, we have so many questions we could really put before God, you know. Why do bad things happen? Life was one disaster after another for Job. His friends insisted that he must have done something wrong, that God was just getting even with him. That he must have committed some great sin that he needed to confess. But Job knew better. Job, he knew better. You ever felt like God was letting you down? And that you had nowhere, you ever have a complaint and nowhere to take it? We guys know that, don't we, let guys? Ever felt like there was no one that even really cared a whole lot about what was going on in your life? Job is filled with this sense that he is suffering unjustly, that he is not getting a fair shake with life. And when he starts to try to pray and talk to God, he feels as though God is not even paying attention to what's going on in his life. There are people that are religious by nature, but they're called deists. And basically what that means is they believe in God. They believe God gets everything kind of started, puts it on autopilot, and then goes off and sits back and just watches. God's not really involved with our lives. God's not that way. Job feels like that God's not answering his questions when he talks to him. He feels like God is somewhere else. Eli read that passage for us this morning. I go to the north, I think, you know, he doesn't know where God is, where God's going to pop up. And even in the 13th chapter, though, in the 13th chapter of this incredibly delightful book, Job kind of shrugs his shoulders and he says, you know what? Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. I'll still trust him. Job cannot see any answers to his question. He can't see any way of moving forward. He doesn't see any real signs of hope. And you know, he's got to be at a point where he can't see any good reason to go on trusting in God and believing in this God. And yet, he still persists. From time to time, I've mentioned some of the writings of Anne Lamott in our worship service here. She's an incredible author to read. And she talks sometimes about her journey to faith. It was not always an easy journey for her. It had some pretty bumpy spots. When Anne was a single mom, raising little Sam, she and Sam's father had split before Sam was born. And so she began life by raising the little boy herself. And over the years, there was very, very little contact between Anne and the boy's father. Almost no contact, a little bit, but not much. There was absolutely no contact between the dad and little Sam. Not at all. Around the age of 7, Sam began to wonder about his dad. And he began to ask some questions. Mom, where does my dad live? What does he do? Why doesn't he ever contact me? Why don't I ever get to see him? Why doesn't he come to my activities like other dads do? Sam began to ask all those questions. And like Job, little Sam didn't get just a whole lot of answers. Now, Anne was a Christian woman, and she was doing the very best she could. And so she began to work hard to try to help find Sam's dad and get the two connected. And one night she was listening to her young son pray. He was in the bedroom and he was praying. And that's when Anne had her Job moment. That's when she says, I lost it with God. She took a deep breath and she looked at the sky and she said, God, would it have been so much skin off your nose to at least give my child one small answer? She was frustrated. But then Anne remembered something that she had read. A writing by Wendell Berry. In one of his essays, he wrote these words. He said, when it gets darker and darker, then Jesus is born. Hear that again. When it gets darker and darker, then Jesus is born. Jesus came when things were really dark. The story with Anne and Sam has a nice ending, because eventually Anne was able to get in good contact with Sam's dad. And she was able to arrange a meeting, and Sam was able to get some answers to some of his questions. And some of the answers were hard to hear. Some of the answers were not what little Sam wanted to hear. But at least there was a dialogue beginning. Anne says that eventually Sam and his dad, developed a pretty healthy relationship. There was the point in the search when it took faith to keep trying. A point where it took faith to keep believing that God was indeed engaged in the process. Even when it did not appear God cared. Even when it did not appear as though God was doing anything, it took faith to keep believing that God was engaged. I would suggest that if we aren't there this morning, that some point along our personal journey in life, we will all be there in one stage or another. And it will take faith to keep going, to keep trying, even when all of the evidence around us seems to indicate that it's futile. You could ask God one question, what would it be? I asked that question of a lot of folks and got a lot of delightful answers, but one of my favorite answers came from our youth minister, Pam. Pam and I were chatting, and I said, okay, Pam, if you could ask God one question, what would it be? And she thought for a second and then just looked at me and she said, you know what I think I'd ask God? God, how am I doing? Isn't that a delightful question? If you could ask God one question, ask God this. God, how am I doing? How am I doing with my faith journey? How am I doing handling that commandment that you gave us to love one another as you... God, how am I doing with my relationship with you? I would invite you this week, at least once, to find a place where you can sit down by yourself and just ask that question out loud. I think it would be nice to ask it out loud because that way you can actually hear yourself say it. And just go, God, okay, how am I doing? And then have the courage to sit still and take time and listen to the quiet as God begins to work and plant that answer in your heart. I invite the ushers to come forward now as we receive the morning offering, an offering that will help us to continue the ministry of this body of faith.